Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our November 19th special meeting of the City Council. Could we please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, if I could just go around the room, and those council members that are here, just state your name and what district you represent. We'll start with Councilman Donovan.
Councilman Gary Donovan, Councilman at Large, present.
Councilwoman Colleen O'Connor, Council at Large, here.
Councilwoman Bridget Hosky, 1st District, present.
Councilman Robin Hamilton, 5th District, present.
Councilman Peter Massaro, 6th District, present.
And Councilman Ron Quagliani, Council at Large. Thank you. I'll read the call of the special meeting. In accordance with Rule 11 of the rules governing the actions of the City Council, Chairman Quagliani has called the special meeting of the West Haven City Council to be held at 1 p.m. on Friday, November 19th, 2021 in the Harriet North Courtroom, 2nd floor, West Haven City Hall. The purpose of this special meeting is as follows: City Council workshop, presentation by Connecticut Conference of Municipalities regarding the American Rescue Plan program, and Q&A by the council. At this time, I will turn the meeting over to the Finance Chair, Councilwoman Hosky.
Thank you, Chairman. The time is now 1:07. I'm sorry, I couldn't see. And do I have to say who's on my committees here?
No.
Okay. So we have Michael Musinski. Did I say, was I close?
Yes.
Oh, excellent. From Connecticut Conference of Municipalities. If you want to come to the podium, that would be great. Oh, yay. Trinae, Councilwoman Trinae McGee and Councilman Robert Bruno are here as well.
Yeah, just for the record, at 108, Councilwoman Trinae McGee of the 7th District and Councilman Robert Bruno of the 9th District are here as well.
Thank you. So this is Michael. He's from the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities, and he's going to present to us the American Rescue Plan and some information. Take it away. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. Do you mind if I take this off?
Fine.
It's a little warm. Well, thank you for the invitation to be here today. My name is Mike Musinski with the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities, State and Federal Relations Manager with CCM, focusing on state and more specifically federal relations, and the American Rescue Plan has been a focus of mine since it was adopted in March. Certainly happy to come to various municipalities, discuss this important program because it is so unique. And some of the details that I'm going to go over may be redundant, but I'm hopeful that they may provide some context and answer some questions that you may already have. And I'll certainly afford the opportunity to answer any specific questions that you have. So, as I mentioned, the American Rescue Plan is very unique in a number of different ways. Most specifically in the sheer significance of the amount of funding that is being distributed to all municipalities. I don't believe there's been any state or federal program similar to this, at least in my time, at least. So for Connecticut municipalities as a whole, Connecticut towns and cities received about $29 million of direct assistance for, that should actually be, $29 million. For you all, you received about $18 million, I believe. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me take a step back. I'm looking at the wrong notes here. Connecticut municipalities received $1.56 billion. The city of West Haven received $29 million. Clarify that. I apologize. So it's a significant amount of money. And not only is this program unique in just the sheer volume, but it's also unique in the fact that it was a direct allocation. It's an automatic allocation. Cities and towns didn't have to apply for it. It was directly distributed from Treasury to municipalities. So therefore, there is no review process. That's the last part that makes it so unique, is that it really puts the onus on each individual municipality to ensure that you are in compliance with the rules and obligations for each municipality and the projects that you choose to embark upon. So I'm going to go into the program, but also the rationale for this unique allocation formula. So if you recall back in the first coronavirus relief fund that passed in early 2020, that was soon after the pandemic really struck, Congress really wanted to get money out the door. So they distributed a bunch of funds to states with the hope that they would then distribute it down to municipalities, businesses, residents. Connecticut, we were fortunate. We did work collaboratively with the state to have a bunch of those funds received at the local level. However, that wasn't the case for a lot of other municipalities and states throughout the country. And there were still a lot of municipalities to this day that never received a dime from the first tranche of funding. So Congress certainly heard that from a number of local officials when they were developing the American Rescue Plan, and so Treasury needed to come up with a different formula to provide direct allocation to towns and cities, and they came up with a modified CDBG formula. So if you're familiar with the CDBG program, if you're an entitlement community, you're receiving your direct allocation from Treasury. If you're a non-entitlement community, you're receiving your funding indirectly from the state. City of West Haven is an entitlement city. You have a population above 50,000, so you're receiving a bulk of your funds directly from Treasury. What also makes this unique is the fact that Connecticut lost out on a significant amount of revenue in the first round of funding because we don't have county form of government. However, we were successful as an organization working with our congressional delegation and the National League of Cities in actually putting into the American Rescue Plan Act a specific provision that says for states that don't have county form of government, municipalities can still receive funding as if we did have county form of government. So we didn't lose out on that funding. That was about $690 million of county funds, and that was distributed regardless of whether you're an entitlement or non-entitlement community from the state. They serve as a pass-through. So that's certainly very unique to this program. It's important to point out that the state has no control over the funding. They have no control over restricting funds or what you can use the funds on. They're simply a pass-through. There's actually specific provisions within that bill that state that if the state tries to control your funds, they can lose out on their own funding. And again, the funding is going to be received in two tranches. You should have already received the first tranche, which was in May, June or so. The second tranche will be received 1 year from the first allocation. In the Act, it outlines what the eligible uses are. However, the Department of Treasury created, and you probably have seen it, the interim final rule. It's rather thick, comprehensive, but it's really ambiguous. There's not a lot of clarity in certain areas, and that is really what's guiding your operations and your eligible uses. We're hopeful that the final rule, which is intended to come out in the next couple of months, will provide a little bit of clarity. Treasury, during this period of time, they sought comments from different stakeholders. CCM, we provided comments, suggesting to Treasury to make some modifications, but more or less to provide some clarity in a lot of those areas that were very vague. So the interim final rule really breaks down those eligible use categories, and I'll go into them in a little bit detail, but in brief, the eligible use categories are responding to the public health emergency, addressing negative impact caused by COVID, providing premium pay for essential workers or rehiring staff, providing investments in infrastructure, specifically water, sewer, broadband, and then to offset any sort of revenue loss. Now, it's important when you look at the rule, not only is it broken down into these categories, but it's also subcategorized into a non-exclusive list of eligible categories. So it's non-exclusive, but it's just suggestions. ineligible uses. Specifically, you can't use the funds to pay any sort of pension debt. You can't use it to pay any sort of liability exposure. You can't use it to pay legal settlements. And then the third area is encouraged uses. So specifically, if you have a qualified census tract, or you want to use the funds towards those that were disproportionately impacted because of COVID, the Treasury rule really encourages uses and specific eligible uses in those categories. And it's important to note that, again, it's not an exhaustive list that's in the rule, and there's somewhat of a process that you can kind of go through to determine whether a project is eligible or not eligible if it's not specifically referenced. And it's really a three-pronged process. You really need to tie it back to COVID. First, what harmful effect was caused or exacerbated by COVID that you're intending to use the funds on? Will the funds address that harm? And then third, can the evidence be provided to ensure that it will produce the desired outcome? And that's kind of a three-step process that you can kind of go through. Whenever I meet with groups or answer questions, field phone calls on whether a project is eligible, I always take a step back, kind of go through that process, try and make sure that it relates to a harm that was caused by COVID. The funds need to be obligated by 2024, but not necessarily spent until 2026. This allows for greater latitude, in particular with maybe capital projects or those infrastructure projects. And then it's important to note that most of the funds are prospective in nature, meaning you can't use the funds for costs that were incurred early in the pandemic. It's really just those costs that were incurred March 3rd of 2021 going forward. There are some exceptions, and I'm happy to elaborate on those a little bit further, but for the most part, they are specifically just for projects going forward. Now, to kind of go into specific details on those eligible projects, first, support public health response. What does that mean? You can use the funds to contain and mitigate the spread of COVID-19 or future pandemics. So examples of particular projects could be vaccination incentives, medical expenses, quarantine costs, or implementing mitigation strategies. Implementing mitigation strategies could be outfitting new office space to provide social distancing. A lot of communities are looking at this category to improve air quality within municipal settings. So you can certainly use the funds to improve air quality. That can mean improvements to HVAC work. Again, you just need to relate the work that it's providing increased air quality within congregate settings, congregate municipal settings. So the same would hold true with whether it's town hall or another municipal building that is a congregate setting. Not only did the pandemic, as you all know, impact our physical lives, but it also impacted behavioral health and mental health. And so you can use the funds to address behavioral health services, and some of those categories can be substance abuse treatment and prevention programs, crisis intervention programs. As well, you could also use the funds to help pay for the salary or expenses for certain public safety or public health staff where their sole responsibility is COVID-19 response. So a public health director or someone that's focusing primarily on the response due to the pandemic, you can use the funds to help pay for their salary. And then you can also provide premium pay for essential workers. The interim rule dictates who is an essential worker and specifics of what the premium pay is. And again, I can go into those details if you wish. The second category is addressing.
I'd like you to do that when you.
Sure.
Okay.
Of course. Actually, I'll just go into it now. So providing premium pay, essential workers would be, again, the interim rule really lists it out, but they would be police, fire, even janitorial staff, those individuals that really had to be necessary for the operations of municipal government. Unfortunately, it doesn't appear as if a mayor, first selectman, town manager fits in those categories. It's really those responders. And the premium pay is I believe it's $13 per hour, or not to exceed an aggregate total of $25,000. Yeah. Teachers, I believe. Yeah. And that's an important point. Thank you for bringing up teachers, because this is funds that is disseminated to municipal governments. Boards of education receive their separate tranche of funds, and they have their own rules separate from this as far as what they can use the funds on. If the municipal government wants to allocate a portion of your funds to your Board of Education, you can certainly do that. You could do that without impacting your MBR. It's considered an in-kind contribution, but that is certainly something that you can do. So moving to a rather broad category, addressing the negative impacts caused by COVID.
I'm sorry, Michael.
Yeah.
And respectfully, only because we're recording this and residents might go in and watch this.
Mm-hmm.
Could you just, may not be in the know of what you meant, like in kind and it not impacting. I know what you mean,
Yeah.
but just so that they understand that it's not something we have to do every year.
Yeah, so the minimum budget requirement is something where, as you all know, when you appropriate funds to the boards of education, you're pretty much obligated to carry over that expense year after year after year. Utilizing this as a one-time in-kind contribution ensures that it's just one-time revenue, it's a one-time expense. It does not need to be a reoccurring expense year after year after year. Hopefully that explains.
Yes. No, and I just wanted to make
Yep,
sure.
of course.
Like, what does that
I
mean?
understand.
Yeah,
Well, yep.
thank you.
And I apologize, sometimes I've been in the weeds on a lot of this stuff. I've second-guessed myself on a lot of things. Sometimes I don't cover certain areas, so I'm happy to have this be an active dialogue. So addressing the negative impact caused by COVID, one of the big areas is providing direct assistance to businesses and residents. What does that mean? You can provide loans and grants to businesses. That's a big category that I know a number of communities are looking at. If you want to use a particular community as an example, I would suggest looking at the town of East Windsor. They had a really great program in engaging their businesses, providing a grant program to them for businesses that were impacted by COVID. They just completed the review process, and I believe that they are just in the process of finalizing that, actually getting checks out the door to these businesses. If you have the opportunity to look at that program, it's called the ERASE Grant. I forgot what the acronym stands for, but it's a great program, and the final report is on their website. You can take a look at it. It really goes through the metrics of how they determine who is eligible, who wasn't, and then a breakdown of each of the businesses and what they plan to use the funds for. Other communities are looking at building business incubator programs, providing child support in that regard too, so trying to encourage fostering greater business growth in their community. Looking at workforce development, assisting manufacturing and agricultural businesses, and then direct housing assistance. And the housing assistance can be comprehensive in a number of different ways. You can provide overall affordable housing initiatives. You could provide rental assistance. It really, the interim rule kind of has a number of different factors. Another category underneath this is expanding tourism and hospitality, knowing that especially in other areas of the country, but also here in Connecticut that was impacted. So some communities are looking at creating commercial and tourism coordinators and corridors within their community, looking at marketing opportunities, and then improving outdoor spaces and outdoor recreation programs. Now this is where I start to say, when I talk about programs, a lot of these examples and programs that I use, you can align them with a number of different categories, right? Like, so improving outdoor space and outdoor recreation programs can fall underneath economic recovery, can fall underneath public health, trying to get people outside. It's important to note that, and I'll get into this a little bit when it comes to the reporting, you need to when you're thinking of projects, you need to think of one single category that it would fit under. And that's going to be necessary when you do your reporting. So just try and find the best fit, if you will, for what that program tends to be used for. So you can certainly use it for improving outdoor recreational programs, facilities. If you have parks that were overused during the pandemic or you had to delay maintenance on them, you can certainly use the funds to help make those necessary improvements. And then overall topic of economic recovery. It's important when you do think about economic recovery initiatives, you think of it just as that, economic recovery, not necessarily economic development. I know that isn't necessarily the best thing that some developers want to think about, but that's going to be necessary when you do your reporting to Treasury. They're going to want to see it's an economic recovery because of COVID or something you're trying to improve upon something that was harmed. If you use the phrase economic development, that could be a red flag for them to look into those programs a little bit deeper. And a big caveat to this overall program is the fact that if you invest in an ineligible project, you don't do your reporting properly, the Department of Treasury can come back several years from now, audit, and seek recuperation of those funds. So there really is a big onus on the municipality to ensure that you are in compliance. Is there any questions in regards to this category before I move to the next one? I think that might be easiest.
Economic recovery would be like helping restart a daycare that had to close because of COVID, but someone brand new coming in and opening a daycare would be development. Am I getting that correct?
It could be, and I will preface a lot of my my answers to potential projects as it could be. So yes, for your first question, yes, those that had to shut down. For your second one, you can certainly make the argument if they were in the process of starting up their daycare and they didn't get it fully functioned, but the pandemic hit them. You could certainly make an argument where maybe they could be, you can use the funds to invest in them, but that's a gray area. It really comes down to the details of each individual program.
Thank you.
Yeah?
Yeah, so that's where I struggle with the gray area. So,
Yeah,
so
we all do.
So just a couple of things, if I
Yeah.
can.
Well, can we just, 1 second?
Sure.
So we're all gonna probably have a ton of questions, so
Yeah.
we're just gonna kind of go around the
Yeah,
table.
Of course.
But Chairman, go right ahead.
Sorry about that. So who is the actual owner of the plan? When the plan is done and submitted, what governmental entity is tasked with being the owner of the plan?
The municipality.
So it's just a municipality in general, typically?
Yes.
Okay.
So, and that's a good point. We've sought legal interpretation on, who has the final authority. We've determined that it is not an executive function. You should treat this as supplemental revenue. So whatever process that you would undergo when dealing with supplemental revenue or a special grant, that's how you should allocate these dollars.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, but, so typically it would be the executive branch would bring the grant request to the council would review it.
Yep.
Either up or down or make modifications. So that's, I think, the same way this is gonna go. Who is the reporter?
The municipality is the reporter.
So we would assign someone that's tasked to report out every, whatever it may be, quarter that we're in compliance or whatever that may be to Treasury, correct?
Yes. And I can go into those. I plan to go in a little bit.
Oh, yeah, good.
The reporting aspects
okay.
of it. I can certainly elaborate on that now, but I think it might be best to just
And
wait.
just one last question. So you said the funds have to be obligated by 2024, spent by 2026.
Yep.
Obligated means what?
Obligated means that you need to have it essentially earmarked, appropriated in some way, fashion. It doesn't necessarily mean that the checks need to be written, but we've interpreted it to mean that a final action is likely then by the council that you're appropriating the funds
An approved
towards X, Y, or
contract
Z.
to do X, Y, Z, or,
Yes.
or whatever it may be. And so we have not approved the plan yet.
Mm-hmm.
So is there a deadline to approving the plan?
No, and I will calm your fears in saying that you are probably in a very similar situation as most municipalities. I think there was an inclination when this first came out to rapidly get this money out the door. And I think for some communities, they looked at, and one of our suggestions has been, look at immediate need for businesses and residents that need it. But a majority of them have only spent a very small percentage of their funds on the immediate need and then taken a step back and developed a plan. Most are probably halfway through that planning development process. They are not close to getting checks out the door.
And the second part of my last question is, could you say we decide on, there's 3 things that we know we really want in this plan now, so we could put, the mayor puts those forward, the council agrees and passes that. Can we then go back and continually add to the plan, or do we have to have a plan?
No.
We
You can
keep
make modifications.
adding up to whatever the The dollar amount is,
Yes.
right?
Yeah,
Okay.
and I can kind of touch on that based on what we know so far as in regards to your reporting requirements.
Okay, that's helpful, thank you.
Yeah.
So what is the January 31st date?
So the
Because
January,
these-
yeah, so the January 31st date, before I kind of, I'll go back to the infrastructure and revenue loss category afterwards, but I think it's important because we're talking about the reporting. I can discuss the reporting requirements right now. So for a metropolitan or entitlement city like West Haven, there are two reports that's needed. One was your interim report that was due August 31st. We thought that was going to be an annual report. I believe it's only going to be a one-time report. You don't need to worry about that anymore. So going forward, the only thing you need to worry about is a project and expenditure report. And this will be done quarterly. So the end of, basically 30 days after the first part of each quarter. So it'll be the end of January, end of April, end of July, end of October. You'll need to provide this project and expenditure report. And this will be done through a treasury portal. That has not been set up yet. I believe they're still in the development stages of it. I know Treasury has indicated that once it is up and running, they will provide webinars, training, documentation as far as how that will be, but it's very much going to be, we understand, like what you're going to need to provide is, for each project, you're going to need a description of the project, so 50 to 250 word explanation as far as what the project is, what category it fits under. I had mentioned before, you really need to identify one specific category, so you need to highlight what category it fits under, and then in that description you can always put, it fits also underneath category B, C, D. And then you're going to need to provide in that report the project details, the expenditure cost, what it actually costs, and the time period. Then you're going to need to provide a status, and then as this is going to be a quarterly report, you're going to go in, we assume, every quarter, and you're going to have to look through those existing projects and then just modify that status, modify any sort of changes to the expenditure cost or the time period. Maybe it got pushed out a little bit, or it was completed ahead of schedule. You can make those modifications, but that's the need for that quarterly report. You will also need to provide, we believe, your budget, your adopted budget based to date. I don't know what, for this January 31st, what budget you will need to provide. We anticipate probably it'll be what budget you're operating under currently. And that's going to be based on if you've determined revenue loss. And I'll get into that revenue loss category in a second. And then you're also going to need to provide any sub-recipients that you've given the money to. So as I mentioned before, if you have a business grant program, and you decide to allocate a portion of your funds to various businesses, those are then sub-recipients of these funds. That doesn't mean that you're not obligated and you pass along the reporting responsibilities. Every dollar, whether you appropriate it to a sub-recipient or not, you are responsible for the reporting. And when I mean you, I just mean the municipality. It is the municipality's responsibility to ensure that that sub-recipient is in compliance with, the activities that they indicated that they were going to use the funds on. It's important to point, you had referenced before, delegating a particular staff member to assist with the reporting and the administration of these costs.
Can I ask a question regarding that?
Yep.
Do you know, in any of, dealing with any of the municipalities, are they hiring somebody to manage this ARPA funding? Like, is there a person? Because all this stuff you're telling me, we're getting $28 million. It's a lot of money. It's a lot of accountability. Have you heard of any best practices, and then can the ARPA money be used to pay somebody to manage this?
That's a great question. That's what I was getting into a little bit, is you can use the funds. If you do need to hire someone to administer a program, you can use the funds to pay that individual, whatever the cost is to administer the program, to do the reporting requirements. You can use the funds towards that salary individual, whether it's an existing staffer or it's a new individual. Now, we haven't identified any consultants that are willing to do this, and I don't know as an organization whether we will or not, because it's difficult to vet some individuals as far as their ability levels. And so I know some communities that have utilized some consultants. For instance, in East Windsor, the first selectman utilized an individual that he had worked with in the past on particular grants, and he was newly retired, and so they just hired him as a consultant to complete these duties. Some other communities are looking at former town managers, former employees that know the inner workings, don't necessarily want a full-time job, but are still willing to contribute to the town and administer these programs. Other communities are looking at partnering with chambers of commerce. I know in Hartford, they're utilizing the Metro Hartford Alliance to assist in developing some of the plans. And I don't know if administering or reporting, but they're definitely assisting in helping in some of that. They're also contracted with a firm to assist in some of their infrastructure projects. And then there's also councils of government. Every council of government is a little bit different as far as their ability level, but certainly that is an avenue if you want to see about the COG's ability to assist in some of these, whether it's the reporting, whether it's document management, whether it's project development. That's another avenue that some communities are looking at.
Can I ask another question?
Of course.
So I understand that 2024 is when we need to have a plan to spend the money. We need to spend the money by 2027.
2026.
2026. Thank you. So this is my question. You're talking $29 million sitting in our bank, which is going to accrue some interest.
Yep.
That interest is, like, in 2026, is it that bank account supposed to be at zero? Spend all the interest, like, that interest that we keep accruing, I'm just saying, can that be, say, moved over to fund a pension like you discussed before, since it's not that initial?
Yep. That's a good question. And so.
Well, thank you, that's true to know.
The money can certainly, I know a number of communities have put it into a separate non-lapsing account. It can accrue interest, unlike other federal programs that indicate that if you put it into an interest-bearing account, you have to give back that interest. You don't have to in this program. However, you have to use the funds towards an eligible project under ARP. So taking any interest gained and putting it towards pension would be ineligible.
Yeah, I'm just curious, so we could still just keep spending that money?
Yep,
until we get to
it's
zero?
all yours. Any interest that you earn is the municipalities.
So is there like 2026, December 31st, or is it, do you know?
I forgot the exact, I know it's stipulated, it's in
It's
the
not
rule,
the end
it's
of
in
the
there,
year.
but yeah,
Okay.
it's I think by the end of the calendar year.
So all of it has to stay there and we just keep spending it?
Yeah, and
Okay.
there certainly is the caveat. I know Congress right now, in the House at least, they're debating a bill to provide a little bit more flexibility in regards to the eligible uses and possibly pushing out that date a little bit further. So that can certainly be a moving target in the next couple of years. I mean, 2026 is a number of years away. Congress can certainly move that. You have to understand that this program is for states and municipalities, and throughout the country. So, if Congress is going to hear from governors too, that, hey, can you give us a little bit more leeway on spending these funds? I think there may be some willingness to kind of maybe extend that for a period of time. But right now, anticipate that 2026.
Thank you. I know, yeah, go ahead. Mayor Rossi.
Thank you very much for coming. I hope you can hear me okay.
Yeah.
I enjoy CCM, and I've gotten quite a few of the webinars and information, but there's still such a vast amount of information out there. So one of my questions was, and did get answered immediately when we did get the first allotment of funds, we did put it in an interest-bearing account. Because I always figured if for some reason it was ruled out, but I had read where exactly what you said, that, then we'd have to give it back, but at least, we're accruing the interest. What I wanted to ask, you talked about business and, that was harmed during COVID, and businesses, whether they be small or mid-size or larger businesses. we have, several businesses that fall into that category, as does everyone else. So one of my questions is, because this has come up, if somebody like puts together, whatever, a group of stores, retail, whatever it is, and they weren't able to lease them because of the pandemic, because people were not interested, is that an eligible use if there is an incentive program for that?
Yeah, so just thinking about it, I might have to take a little bit more time to think about it, but.
I didn't stump you.
Yeah. Certainly, again, looking at it, prospective nature of it, you can certainly provide incentives to encourage businesses to lease the space. You can certainly probably provide some sort of financial assistance, but the specific details would probably be dependent on the specific harm.
Okay, because this plan, it's not a secret or anything that was proposed. They're doing like X amount of months for rent payments or lease payments, whatever you want to call it. And so say it's 5, then you would have to stay in this, whatever they want to store, whatever it may be, 4 or 5 years. Your property would be lien to protect you, protect the owner, that, they didn't take off and, we lost our money, so that's an important thing. And so this is one of the things that I know the council is looking at and has been looking at, and I myself have been involved in it. So I know that, so that's why I'm asking you, because again, that's the hardest thing about all this information. You talk to one person, they can say one thing, you talk to another person, they may say, but I find that CCM has usually the right answers. In fact, always, I haven't found them with the wrong answer yet.
I appreciate that. And I will say that it really is dependent, but I'd happy to work with you specifically on how to navigate that water to see if there's a possibility to ensure that it is eligible.
Okay, because I definitely, and I just have one more quick one. The other one is, obviously, we have a very depressed downtown area now, and it's gotten 10 times worse during the past couple of years because of COVID and the continuing. It's not done yet.
Yeah.
That being said, it is extremely depressed. So we need some sort of, big deal going on here. Now, what I'm going to ask is, again, is this an eligible use? So we own a building right now, the city does, and it's the old Masonic Lodge. It's within, stone's throw away from here. Are we allowed to use any of the ARPA funds to turn that into an arts center that would be for performing? Because I want to be clear, because sometimes I say an art center, people think we're going to hang paintings on the wall. I'm sure there'll be art in there and there'll be art shows, but I'm looking for a full art center that would have performances, something similar to like a cabaret in Bridgeport or something along that line. Are we allowed to use this money or a portion of this money, or are there any guidelines yet for a project like that?
It should be.
Okay.
It sounds reasonable enough. It was disproportionately impacted because of COVID. You weren't able to make the necessary improvements. Again, it's looking at that expanding tourism, arts and culture initiatives are certainly an eligible expense in some categories. So again, I'm always going to preface by saying it should be. The devil's in the details, but I'd be happy to work offline.
What is it about that saying?
Can I just ask, so to your point, so is there any way that, again, obviously, we don't want to, I know I don't want to speak for the council, but no one wants to spend this money, I know I don't, and then find out afterwards, to your point, down the road, it was an ineligible expense. Is there any kind of pre-approval that you can send in with all the details?
Can we send it to you, Mike? This is ask for what we need.
I'm afraid of that too, because again, as I said, there's so many bodies of information out there, and most of them are in sync. That is there a pre-approval process that you can, kind of like a loan. They're not going to give you the money right out of the gate. You have to put some information down before you get it.
Yeah, so I'm certainly happy to be a resource. I have been, but I will tell you, my response will be, it should be, or it should not be. We're certainly not in a position, and it's difficult to find someone that's in a position to give a declaratory ruling, unfortunately. There is no other pre-approval process. I don't believe the state's willing to put themselves in that position. We had inquired if Treasury has an ability to submit questions. There is an ability to submit questions to Treasury, but the response time, you may not receive anything. And we had asked specifically if you can get a pre-approval process or a conduit, but you have to remember, again, nationwide program facilitating states, municipalities, counties, tribal governments throughout the country. They would be inundated. They wouldn't be able to answer things accordingly. So we're trying to do it the best of my abilities. The way I've tried to calm the fears has been that as you become more knowledgeable of the eligible uses, you become more familiar with the projects, and then you look at the reporting that's required. I think that'll help answer and alleviate some fears, because as you look at a particular project, you have to look at the reporting. What category does it fit under? What type of harm was caused? Is this funding actually going to achieve its desired impact? I think that process, when local officials undergo that process, they have a better sense of comfort.
One last one, just for not-for-profits. Is there any other municipality right now that has already set something up for them? And what I mean by that is, I know that's one of the eligible uses there, that's pretty clear. But there are not-for-profits that are actually doing okay still, and then there's ones that have suffered tremendously. It depends on, contributions. I didn't know of anyone else yet, because only a few, I know a lot have not put their plans up yet, because to your point, and I knew that, it's a very labor-intensive project, and you don't want to slap it together so people haven't taken their time, and plus new stuff has come out. So as far as not-for-profits, has there been anybody, because again, do we look at income requirements, what they have for donations or different things, or do you just give everybody some? So I didn't know if anybody had come up with a plan, because if they did, I'd love to be able to look at it.
So I know right down the road, Milford is looking at doing some work with nonprofits. The specific program I'm not too familiar with, but in regards to certainly, I think non-for-profits, number one, they were impacted by COVID financially, and so that is again providing a grant program to businesses. Nonprofits are a business in a lot of sense, so providing them direct allocation, but also they provide a service. So when you look at different projects and initiatives, you can utilize nonprofits as a conduit to get the money out the door to serve specific, vulnerable individuals, those disproportionately impacted. So non-for-profits are an important partner in this. I know a number of communities are looking at it, both in both of those senses, as far as the direct financial assistance, as well as using them to facilitate greater assistance to those impacted.
Thank you, thank you.
Chair, can I ask a
So
question? Rock, paper, scissors?
I got it. So can I? So it really does seem that we need a facilitator. Like, we need somebody dedicated to this job. So I'm just, that's just really resonating in my mind to make sure it's all handled correctly. So I know that you said there is a huge difference between recovery and development, not development, but recovery. And that if any of the reporting that we have to do in January, April, June, and August, but I'm not sure what it was, the project and expenditure report, it has to, I'm thinking that it has to show how it benefited. Like, there needs to be, so if we wanted to expand or use money for the art center, this long-awaited art center, it has to be a catalyst for this recovery to bring people back out, back into West Haven, out of their houses, being involved. So it's really, the devil is in the details, and how that, we just have this thing, and how that's written up, and how it answers to each one of those bullet points.
Yes, yes.
Jim? Yes.
Thank you. So Mike, listen, some of these things in here, so investments in water and sewer, so which is terrific. If we run down the whole line, wastewater treatment plants, control and non-point points of pollution, create green infrastructure, manage and treat stormwater. I mean, we have all those issues, right? So we really need some capital investment. So 2 questions. If we already have projects identified in the existing budget, can we, instead of bonding that money, utilize ARPA money for some of these eligible projects? That's part 1. And number 2 is, I know there, right behind this somewhere is gonna be a pot of infrastructure money. So I think my question to you is if you have a crystal ball, would you suggest that we utilize this money in other ways, because we're going to be more restricted in the next pot of money just to focus strictly on infrastructure?
Sure. 2 great questions. So, and I was going to expand upon the infrastructure investments. So the interim rule really relies on, so the act specifically referenced that you could use this funding in infrastructure categories of water, sewer, broadband. And what Treasury basically said is, we're not going to determine what's eligible or not eligible. We're going to rely on the EPA's Clean Water Revolving Loan Fund project and the Drinking Water Revolving Loan project as qualifiers. So basically, if a project would be eligible underneath those 2 categories, they would be an eligible expense under ARPA. So as you mentioned before, wastewater treatment, managing, treating sewer, stormwater, upgrading facilities to improve water quality. A number of communities are looking at this category. They certainly are. I know it's a big investment. What's important to point out also is that there's a little bit more latitude as far as you can use the funds also for the design and engineering costs associated with infrastructure projects. If you need to utilize it to do distribution lines in a road or a particular facility, you can utilize the funds to bring that road back to the way it was. So basically the repaving of it. You don't need to separate out what's specifically related to EPA's program, what's specifically not. If you've already identified the project, but you haven't bonded for it yet, then it should be an eligible expense. You can use the ARPA dollars. The gray area is really if you've already started the project with some bonding, but you know that you have to, over a series of time. If you haven't started it, if you've only done the planning stages of it and you haven't allocated a dollar to it, it should be an eligible expense. And then to your point in regards to the infrastructure bill, we are while a lot of the details are yet to be decided, we understand that basically most of the infrastructure funds are going to be repopulating a lot of existing programs in as far as infrastructure development. And I think Congress understood that when they passed ARPA and looking at water, sewer, broadband, they knew when they were going to pass an infrastructure bill, they were going to do something a little bit different. So I think in regards to, you don't want to invest in, utilize your ARPA dollars for these investments and then wait for possible infrastructure money. That infrastructure money is going to be competitive. It's going to be more regional, more statewide, rather than very unique. Again, we don't know a lot of the details yet, but I would assume that if you're looking for specific projects that are typically wouldn't be accepted underneath a DOT grant program, it's probably better to invest using the ARP dollars than to wait for any sort of infrastructure funds.
Okay, makes sense. Thank you.
Is that all, Chairman?
Yes, thank you.
And then the other category, if I can, I'll touch upon one, because I think this might help explain a little bit more as far as a little bit more latitude that you have with some funds. So revenue loss. One of the areas that is allowed underneath an eligible use category is to use the funds towards offsetting any sort of revenue loss. So I don't know if the city has done the calculation as far as whether you've determined revenue loss.
Can I answer that? Michael Mylone, we have a liaison between, so you know.
I know Michael very well.
Michael Mylone has done it. I have never seen a calculation like this in my life. I'm thinking revenue loss is you take a look at what you were supposed to get, what you got, and it's not even close to that. So yes, we're eligible for a lot of revenue loss, a lot, and it's a big number. I mean, I was like shocked, and the calculation is intense, to say the absolute least. So you must be very familiar with it, right? It's not easy.
No, it's not easy. And so again, in the act, it just basically said to offset any sort of revenue loss. Treasury, what they did is they created this really crazy formula. If you look at the interim rule, it's a formula that's really hard to decipher. We've tried to interpret that. Michael probably used the GFOA calculator or GFOA spreadsheet where you basically plug in various numbers and you're able to determine revenue loss. Basically what it is it's a calculation of your base year, which is the full fiscal year prior to January 27th of 2020. You're looking at an average growth of 3 years or 4.1% growth, which is pretty generous. And then you compare it to actual revenue collected. Now, I will say that most communities have determined some sort of revenue loss because this formula is so generous. And the reason behind it is kind of twofold. Fortunately, most municipalities didn't experience a lot of revenue loss. I think most municipalities weathered the storm fairly well. That can't be the same. It can't be said the same for a lot of municipalities throughout the country. So when Treasury created this formula, they looked at those that were most severely impacted. And then Connecticut was just simply able to reap the benefits from that lucrative formula. And so most communities, again, have determined some sort of revenue loss. Some have been able to indicate that they are able to use a majority of their funds on revenue loss. And the reason why claiming revenue loss can be important is the fact that you have greater latitude on what you can spend the funds for. Treasury has indicated if you've determined any revenue loss, whatever that revenue loss difference is, you can utilize it towards any government service. Government service is not necessarily defined in the rule. However, we've been able to interpret it to mean that it's basically anything that a municipality would budget for. Service, capital expense, again, you can't use it towards those prohibited items like pension or legal settlements, but anything that you would typically budget for as an expense would be considered a government service. So that is an important point to note, that even if you you can't identify how a project that you want to invest in fits into a particular category, if you've claimed revenue loss, you can certainly fit it underneath that government service category.
Can I ask one question, Bridget? So here's my question for this, because this is where my head's working. We are under state oversight.
Yes.
We currently have a surplus, but our surplus would not be able to equal the $4 million, which is what is in our budget now as MARB restructuring funds. My question is that are we allowed to use the revenue loss to put into our budget this year? In other words, and when I say this year, I'm talking about FY21, so that would have closed. It is not closed yet, but I mean, it will be closed by the time we do the audit. Is that an allowable use of the revenue loss to get us out of, the restructuring funds business?
Yeah. So I will be honest, I'm not familiar with the oversight and a lot of those details. I will say that when you claim revenue loss and you utilize it towards a government service, that's why part of the reporting you're going to likely need to provide a copy of your budget, is because Treasury is going to want to see how it was allocated, and it needs to go towards that government service. So again, without knowing some of those details, I don't know if I'd be able to answer appropriately.
Well, but if I work something up, I could contact you and maybe we could go over it. That would be great. Thank you.
Any questions on revenue loss? Because I know that's a big area.
Thanks for coming.
Of course.
I'm going to ask you a question. It says that you could use the money for investment of critical infrastructures, particularly well-suited use for ARPA funds because it's non-recurring. What is your definition of critical infrastructures?
So the rule relies on the EPA's two revolving loan funds, the drinking water and clean water revolving loan funds. So whatever critical investments it's identified in those two programs would be investments. And then the third infrastructure project would be broadband. So you can certainly use it to invest in greater broadband usage. Now, I will say that Treasury's taken a very narrow stance into this. They've determined that you need to provide broadband services to unserved or underserved, and they've basically meant that to mean any business or residence that doesn't have 25 megabytes per second of download or upload speed, which I'm not, this isn't my area of forte, but I understand that to be, it's still relatively quick. And it meets the minimum thresholds that most businesses and residents do have already. And you can work remotely, stream Netflix, do a whole bunch of things with 25 megabytes. And to make an investment underneath this broadband category, you need to, that project needs to reliably meet or exceed symmetrical speeds of 100 megabytes per second. So this is one of those categories where we're hopeful that Treasury creates a little bit more latitude, because I know a number of communities were looking to make investments in broadband, understanding that's what's stipulated in the act, but when Treasury came out with the rule and how narrow it is, they've determined that it's not really that applicable to their communities. So whether modifying that access threshold or looking at hardware, utilizing the funds towards hardware investments. I know cybersecurity is a big issue, whether that can fit underneath this category or not. That's something we're hopeful Treasury will consider.
Yep. Going to the broadband, didn't the government just pass a trade, $1.7 trillion to do broadband? Why wouldn't we double it? See what we're going to get out of it.
Yes, yeah, that's a really good point. So the infrastructure bill may be Congress's way of kind of filling that gap. So yeah, I think most communities, again, probably are not going to be using these funds in the broadband category, knowing if they don't reach this threshold or knowing that the infrastructure money may help fill their needs.
Probably this is the last one, Mike, so I just, so based on our conversation and the toolkit, it doesn't seem to me like regular infrastructure repairs are included, such as redoing roads or sidewalks or things of that nature, unless there's water pipes going underneath it and we need to pave the road, right?
Unless you want to use the funds underneath your revenue loss category.
What about expanding tourism and hospitality? Because that was my question. Because if you walk to, and this, I apologize.
That's all right. So, all right. So I understand that piece. So, but also, for example, so we have a senior center, right? So if we decide that, well, because of COVID now, our senior center is not big enough to handle the seniors in West Haven, and we use monies maybe to either expand that location or outfit the location so it's COVID friendly, if you will, that likely would be an acceptable use.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm all set, Chair. Thank you.
So can we go back to the sidewalks? Because I was just thinking that if you were looking for the expanding of tourism and hospitality and you walk around the center and we are trying to do recovery of it and not develop, we're trying to recover it, wouldn't, say, the sidewalk leading up to the art center, wouldn't we want to ensure that it's ADA and that it's, and I'm literally, I tend to push out the box out a little bit, but I'm not necessarily trying to. I'm just trying to think about where the boxes it checks, because I'm thinking if you are looking at, I looked at something else that you said, improve outdoor space. People have talked about, like at our train station, having like a little coffee shop or something that would get people traveling, and it would address this tourism. So we could, and I'm just thinking, because these things pop up in my head, I don't want anyone to think I'm trying to get a coffee shop at the train station, but that it would increase that tourism and hospitality and bring people into the city. And if they're gonna walk from the train station, because you'd go right up Elm and cut over to Center, and all the sidewalks are messed up and there's no real path, as long as you're able to truly tie it back, and you're not doing the sidewalks over, across town or something in that way. Or if I look at it and I think we're trying to increase tourism, and I think about Allentown, and I think about this big street and how people cross, and it's just not safe, but you're trying to get that tourism down there, that you could possibly address some of that if it ties back in.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And the Treasury rule does specify, you can use it towards revitalizing downtown. It doesn't go into a lot of specifics, but facade improvements is one of them, and increasing walkability because of the increased nature of people wanting to get out. To your point, also, increasing tourism, increasing space on a sidewalk to ensure social distancing, that sort of thing. So again, it should be, as long as you kind of go through that process. It's a good practice and exercise to kind of, when you're thinking of projects, kind of taking a step back, looking at how it was impacted by COVID, what are the funds going to be used for. It's a good exercise, and then you can kind of narrow it down as you go through the process, and then you develop that sense of comfort.
Robin?
Yeah, hi, thank you
Hi.
for coming. So I think about the area that I live in, as far as the youth, there's nowhere for them to have outside space. So right now, there isn't outside space for them. So could any of these funds be used to create outside space for them? Even though it didn't exist before, we're not improving it.
Yep.
We're creating it.
Yep. My favorite phrase, it should be. Because you're trying to get people outside, you're trying to create that outdoor space, you're trying to create, you're trying to meet check all those boxes. It should be, again, and the devil's in the details, but it sounds reasonable.
Thank you for that. I like that answer. The other thing is, you said that as we go, as time goes, there'll be maybe more regulations, they'll get tweaked. That's scary.
Yes.
Because what if we started something, we really went through those checklists, and then we find out later, this one is iffy now.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So right now, you're guided by the interim final rule. The final rule should likely come out, we've been told, before the end of the calendar year. So we're getting closer and closer. I've been told that for the past couple of months. I would anticipate it's probably going to be early January. If you do make investments prior to the final rule coming out, as long as in your report you say, and there is a modification and a difference between the final rule and the interim rule, as long as in your reporting you indicate you were relying on the interim rule when you made that appropriation, Treasury has already indicated that'll be an acceptable use. So, and we don't anticipate following that, barring congressional change, that should change after January.
Thank you.
Yep.
And one final question. How about people who are in different areas of the city who suffer from maybe water in their homes, in their basements or whatever? Would this fall under maybe correcting that? It's infrastructure, but I don't know how it really relates to COVID. I'm
Yeah,
not
so
sure.
to fall underneath the infrastructure program, I would need to see if direct assistance to residents would fall underneath the EPA's drinking water program or not. Without knowing the details, again, the rule relies upon those two programs. So to the extent that it allows that, that will determine whether it's eligible or not.
Thank
Um, I guess I want to make sure something like this would fall under mental health. Domestic abuse has gone up considerably because of COVID, and West Haven doesn't have a resource center or shelter. So if we started something like that, would the monies be able to be used for that?
It should be, yes.
Okay.
It falls underneath that behavioral health, crisis intervention, behavioral health services, whether you're making new investments in existing programs or creating new programs as a result of a need, that should be an eligible expense.
And then I had one entirely different question. I just want to make absolutely sure. I know you said the portal's not up yet, but it would be totally acceptable if we hired the facilitator and they went to the portal on January 31st and said, the monies have not been spent yet because we're still in discussion about what to do with them?
That's a very good point, yeah. So if you haven't allocated by anything or invested in any sort of projects by that first reporting deadline of January 31st, you don't need to report anything. Treasury, I believe, has already indicated that. It's only those investments that you're moving forward with
Thank you.
I don't know if there'll be an
That's very
opportunity to put in that report, like, we're thinking about this or thinking about that, but my suggestion would be, if you haven't moved forward with something, leave it blank unless there's a hope that Treasury may provide some sort of insight into a particular project.
Thank you.
Yeah?
You may have answered this, and I wanted to know if this is different from the money being used for a resident personally who's been impacted by flooding. But just for example, like I have a constituent who lives on a dead end, and there's a huge pipe from the street previously before her that sort of leads directly to her house. So every time it floods, her house is damaged by it badly.
Yeah.
Could the funds be used for something like this? I mean, I think it kind of falls under infrastructure.
It
the
should.
Water treatment and sewage and redesigning and engineering. But that alone in itself, the project I was told would be like a couple $1 million. But it specifically impacts her living area. So is that different than?
No, it should be, because the cause of it is, I assume it's a stormwater runoff.
Yeah.
And so stormwater is a category that's eligible underneath the EPA's Clean Water Revolving Loan Fund. So to the extent that it falls underneath that category that I just referenced, you're trying to fix the harm that's causing you're trying to fix the issue that's causing the harm.
Okay, thank you.
Peter?
I got one more question, and I didn't get this off my chest, because if I don't say something, I'm gonna get ridiculed. In the city, we got one fire department, which we run in this department, in this city, and they're antiquated. The two departments, the two stations are shot. Is there any possible way part of these funds could go towards putting aside to start building a new fire station?
That's a good question. I certainly appreciate that. So I live in Weathersfield. I was a firefighter for 10 years. I understand the need. Unfortunately, it probably wouldn't fit underneath the eligible categories, but you can use it underneath the revenue loss category. So it's a government service. Fire service is a government service. So to the extent the municipality wants to use that revenue, any revenue loss, in making those investments in improving fire quality or fire training, fire apparatus, facilities, they can do that.
Thank you.
And I know, just a couple
Can I
of.
just ask a clarifying question? I think I picked up what Councilman Bruno was saying. When you say revenue loss, there's a clear, and I'm probably gonna get some feedback about this, that fire department is expected to fund itself. It has its own tax base. The city is separate. So when you say revenue loss, and I just don't want the residents to get all excited, when you say revenue loss, you're saying on behalf of the city's revenue loss, because the city wouldn't fund them. Their own taxes do.
Okay.
But are we able to allocate it? And then if we do, are we then doing revenue loss for West Shore and the Center District Fire Department?
So, yeah, no, and then I apologize because I wasn't.
You don't have to apologize.
Familiar with,
Yes. No, it's
with the
okay.
structure of how the fire service, and I should know better because.
It's West Haven.
Every community is different taxing districts, their ability to fundraise, and I will say then, you can use the money in the revenue loss category, but it's probably not the most appropriate, knowing that. You could use it because if they are a separate entity, you can certainly possibly appropriate as a subrecipient. They would have to identify that they have endured some sort of harm because of COVID, so they can say we weren't able to fundraise successfully, make those arguments, or if they have a need to make improvements to a facility and they weren't able to do that during COVID, and because of COVID, you can make that allocation as a subrecipient. But again, I understand the different dynamics.
Because they don't fundraise, it's tax
just
dollars
taxing.
and pilot money, so there's not that. So the revenue, I would think the revenue loss would be that their tax base didn't give them all the payment. You know,
Yeah.
that's where that would come from. And I'm not saying yes or no, I just want our residents to have a clear understanding of what that
Sure.
means, and that if we do a gift of revenue, the expectation, I would think, is that the other two fire departments would expect the same in-kind donation. And could that fall under the loss of revenue?
It should be, yeah. I mean, it's
Okay.
essentially they're performing a government service, so that's what it would qualify as a source of lost revenue, but yet understanding or not understanding the nuances of each of the departments and
Right.
their organizational structure and taxing authority, I'd be happy to discuss with you.
No, and I
offline
appreciate that.
on
I just
some of
wanted to
that.
give a little bit more
Yeah,
of
no, I
the clarity
appreciate
on
that.
how that.
Every time I present to individuals, have a discussion, present to councils, I'm always provided little nuances on different ways of thinking about the program, different ideas that I can certainly bring forward to other communities that are impacted. So I try and make sure that I'm both getting some of the information from you to better serve other communities, as well as hopefully sharing some of the best practices from other communities. And one of those, if I can just conclude a couple of different remarks. You know, the toolkit is I know you all have a copy of it. It's a living document, I will say that. We're going to be making modifications, adjustments in the upcoming weeks and months. Primarily once the final rule comes out, we'll be making some modifications there. We're also probably next week going to be providing communities with a list of sample projects that they could consider making investments in based on what other communities are looking at. Again, the caveat being that they should be, but a lot of the devil's in the details. And we're looking at a number of different additions or appendixes to this document. This is a byproduct of an advisory group that we created. We used to meet on a weekly basis, then moved to a monthly, which consists of economic developers, public health experts, economists, municipal attorneys, business leaders, nonprofits. First off, to develop resources like this for municipalities, but also be a direct conduit to municipal government. So these are experts in their policy areas, so if you have a particular question on something, you can certainly, I believe their contact information is available on our website. They've been willing to reach out and work individually with communities. So that's something that we'll be engaged upon for the foreseeable future. And then if I can just share just some best practices and best foundations that I've learned from other communities, and this is not only from communities here in Connecticut, but from across the country. Number one, follow the allowable uses. Again, there's no final arbiter in this. You are all the final arbiter. So we can provide guidance, but it's really the onus is going to be on the municipalities to ensure compliance. So you all know the ramifications if you fail to do so. So an important component of that is to have strong internal financial control mechanisms in place. Mm-hmm. Treasury has articulated that in their reporting documents, that you need to have that, and to a point that was brought up before in regards to hiring one individual that sole responsibility is that can be part of that financial control metric. And especially if you're going to be awarding these to sub-recipients, coordinating all of that, it's going to be important that Treasury sees that from every community, that those mechanisms are in place. What's important to note that even if something is eligible underneath ARPA, you still need to comply with state and federal laws and regulations. So it doesn't escape you from having to comply with some of those regulations. So for instance, if you're making investments in infrastructure, water, sewer, you may need to undergo DEEP or DPH regulations. That doesn't go by the wayside, so you need to make sure that you adhere to those. Any labor contracts or labor issues, you need to make sure you're in compliance with those. Ensure transparency. I think that's something that a number of communities are looking at, and that goes to the overall component of a comfort level of if the community is understanding, and the community, I know you've put out solicitation of different ideas and different concepts from the community. be prepared that a lot of them were probably going to be on the verge of being ineligible just because it's a complex program. But it's a great opportunity to engage the public. I know a number of communities have established special committees or special advisory boards that are comprised of department heads, members of the council. They bring in residents, businesses, nonprofits throughout the community as a sounding board, or maybe like an initial step in developing a program and then delivering it to the council or to the mayor's office. So that's something that you can look at. And every community is kind of doing something a little different, those that have chosen that route. It's important when you make these investments, don't create future deficits. That's something that I think most understand, but I've spoken to a couple where they're looking at making, hiring X amount of employees in certain areas. That's great, it's certainly allowable use, but what are you gonna do after the ARP period? You know, that's gonna be an ongoing expense, so make sure you're aware of that. Really make investments in future prosperity, long-term recovery. You know, and as I mentioned before, you know, take a deliberate approach in developing your plan. Use existing delivery channels like COGS, Chambers of Commerce, nonprofits. And then hopefully we'll have more details once the final rule is released in the next couple of months. And that can certainly dictate and maybe provide you all with a little bit more comfort in some of those eligible project areas. So that's all that I had prepared again, but I'd be happy to answer any questions.
I know I took
Any
you
additional
90 minutes,
questions?
So we're almost there. I know Councilman Bruno does have a
I
question.
just have one question, and thank you very much. It was very helpful. You did
I'm
a really
glad.
nice job. You helped clarify a lot. Thank you very much.
Of course.
What about the city purchasing equipment for this money, like some equipment that's needed for infrastructure or whatnot? Does that fall underneath this?
So if you need to undergo if you're making an eligible investment in an infrastructure project, but you need to purchase equipment to execute that project,
Correct.
I believe we may have had this conversation before. I know I've had it with someone. It should be.
Okay.
It should be because it's an advancement in that category. It should be. I'll leave it at that, but I might have to do a little bit more digging on that and get back to you.
No problem. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, can I just,
Yeah,
Councilman
just,
Donovan?
it's gonna be quick. Mike, thank you again for this, and I believe you answered this. So just say in 2019, somebody started a business, and then COVID hit, so they had to kind of put that on the back burner, but now wants to continue. Would some of this money be able to be used for that?
You can make a direct allocation to a business that was impacted by COVID, yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
I just wanted to make sure. All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Mayor Rossi?
Yes, I just had one other question. So obviously, any plan that I bring forward or anything would have to be blessed by the city council because they're the legislative body. That being said, the plan doesn't have to be fully complete or even halfway complete or 25% complete. Say if there was a project that I wanted to do or the city wanted to do for $300,000, just an arbitrary number. Am I allowed to come before the council to get that approved ahead of time before the plan is complete? Or do you have to wait until the plan's like 50% complete or?
So in that case, it's really dependent on your charter. So if in a normal situation, if you were going to be appropriating funds in that manner, that would be acceptable. This doesn't, you need to follow what's in place. So for your, whatever process that you would undergo for your charter.
Thank you very much.
Anything else? Chairman Quagliani, you all set? No questions? Anyone? Well, I just want to thank you again for coming. I really do appreciate it. I know it's a bit of a height. Great.
No, I appreciate the flexibility in providing a daytime period to provide this information in the evening is quite difficult. So I certainly don't mind traveling. Happy to do it again as
We might
best
take you
as
up on it.
as best as we can to try to just get a sense of comfort for individual municipalities so they understand the rules, they become more accustomed to it, they become more comfortable when they do have to appropriate for these projects. So happy to to be a conduit towards helping implement these projects and be a sounding board if you have any suggestions. Again, the caveat being, I'm likely only going to say it should be. Just be prepared for that.
I
Or
wrote
no.
that down.
Or
I
no.
wrote that down. It should be. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Is there a motion to adjourn? Second? Okay, we're adjourned. Thank you.
That was given to me.